April 30th, 1975, Tong Sang Nut Airport, Saigon. Fighter jets take off from the airport, hoping to provide cover for the ARVN. During the morning, the Communist Viet Cong had made it into the city, and the battle had begun. However, not here. Things were quiet. A large gunship takes off from the airfield and begins shooting. It would remain in the sky for the rest of the day, and long after the battle had ended. Suddenly, forces from North Vietnam began their assault on the airport, and a battle commences. By the afternoon, they begin to push them back. The airport was being defended. But, just as they were winning, the word came in. The government had surrendered, and the flag of the Viet Cong was waving proudly over the newly renamed Ho Chi Minh City. And the Republic of Vietnam was no more. But this was not the end for South Vietnam. Over the years, its memory lived on, and the flag that represented it would be a symbol for a more democratic and free Vietnam. In this video, we won't be diving into the fall of Saigon much, or the Vietnam War, but into the legacy of a nation that is mostly seen as an American puppet state, but its former citizens do not see it that way. Today we will avoid the American narrative of the war and talk about the war from the perspective of South Vietnam and what its residents think today. Today, we see the Republic of Vietnam as a manufactured nation existing only with the help of America, but most of the war did not involve the US. The ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam, amassed a formidable force. The only reason they lost was due to mismanagement from higher ranks and lack of equipment. However, the Special Forces of South Vietnam were actually some of the most experienced in the world, and went on several missions abroad. Another thing to mention is that when Vietnam was split into two, 200,000 went north to communism, but 1 million went south to escape it. And while support for the Republic was mixed in the northern rural communities, in the south and the capital Saigon, support ran high. This has only emerged in the last few years, as the history is being course-corrected by many years of Americans exaggerating their presence. In reality, the American presence in Vietnam was greatly exaggerated. Mostly by Americans themselves, and most people don't even know that there was such a thing as a South Vietnam. History is written by the victors, and for the people who did so much, they have no nation to write for them. In reality, the American presence in Vietnam has been exaggerated, or in some cases outright falsified. Several battles that were credited for the Americans winning were actually won by the South Vietnamese, without any American help. But we should quickly dive into the Vietnam War, and why South Vietnam existed in the first place, as well as how it ended. Editor here, this ended up being a much longer segment than I expected, so enjoy, because this video is basically half history and half current day. Vietnam had been a colony under the French for many years. This area around Saigon, and the area we are going to be focusing mostly on for today, was known as Cochin China. However, in World War II, Japan invaded and united the areas into the Empire of Vietnam, a short-lived state ruled by Bao Dai that lasted about 4 months. After World War II, the French kind of just assumed that they would get all their colonies back now that Germany and Japan were defeated. But that was not to be the case, and several communist and liberal groups in the area fought as a unified force to stop the French from coming back. Eventually, they won, and Vietnam was split into the State of Vietnam, which was under the French Union, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a communist state that controlled the north. The state continued to exist as a member of the French Union until the Geneva Conference in 1954. In that, the Kingdom of Cambodia, Kingdom of Laos, and the State of Vietnam officially became independent. The unstable nation had many leaders before Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, the new Prime Minister, decided that there would be a referendum on the monarchy. He proposed a republic, and the abolishment of the last dynasty in Vietnam, and the abdication of the last emperor, Bao Dai. The referendum ended up winning, with the Republic of Vietnam, aka South Vietnam, being established. Almost immediately, an uprising from the Viet Cong, who were trying to conquer the South and reunify the nation, as well as various crime syndicates, erupted. The syndicates would be defeated, but the Viet Cong remained in small pockets, with supplies coming in through Cambodia and Laos in something that was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1956, independent observers from Poland and Canada were hired by the United Nations to fix the situation. Their conclusion? We don't want to deal with this, and left. The North Vietnamese Communist Party approved a People's War on the South in a session in January 1959. This decision was confirmed by the Politburo in March. They also established a group to maintain the trail from north to south. However, the trail going through Cambodia would be a point of contention, and would lead to a coup and the establishment of the Khmer Republic in 1970. Circling back to 1963, discontent began to grow in the country, leading some villages to just give in to the Viet Cong. This was because Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic nationalist and was actively oppressing several minorities, like Buddhists, for example, and other ethnic minority groups. This, along with the ARVN suffering losses to the Viet Cong, made American support for the Republic wane, as they realized Diem might not be a good ally. In 1962, members of the Air Force bombed the Independence Palace in Saigon. In May 1963, peaceful protests erupted in Saigon and Hue. In response, the government sent special forces to raid several Buddhist temples, leading to death tolls in the hundreds. This resulted in a full-blown mass uprising that lasted until November, when several members of the military decided to overthrow Diem in a coup. The rebels seized key locations in Saigon on November 1st, like radio and police stations. Diem called the U.S. ambassador for help, but received nothing in response. Quickly, loyalists turn on Diem, who flees in a secret tunnel from police. The next day, he's captured and assassinated in the back of an armored personnel carrier. And there's actually a pretty disturbing image of Diem after being shot in the back of the truck. I'm censoring it here, but if you want to find it, it's pretty easy to find. Later that day, the coup leaders announced the formation of a new junta to govern the country. The protests quickly died down, and the country became a bit more stable, save for the fact that there was a war. General Dong Van Minh took command. Thankfully for the South, the U.S. was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where American forces were, supposedly, fired upon by North Vietnam, leading to over 200,000 American troops going to the South. This is where the main character of the story comes in. The country went through 4 prime ministers before elections in 1967, which were pretty much the first democratic elections, resulted in Nguyen Van Thieu. This would symbolize the beginning of true democracy, for now. In 1968, the North and the Viet Cong broke the truce on the holiday of Tet and launched an offensive on that holiday. This was known as the Tet Offensive, and it was the turning point of the war, as the Americans had already been involved in Vietnam for a long time. But this would bring them to realize that the communists would not give up, especially after the Viet Cong actually reached the outskirts of Saigon. This introduced the policy of Vietnamization, a policy to train and equip the South Vietnam Army to handle it themselves. This meant the forces of the Republic would grow to 1.5 million men in active service. However, this would also spell an end to the Republic. An invasion of communist bases in Laos and Cambodia failed miserably. The operation was meant to symbolize the rebirth of the ARVN, but didn't work. In 1972, the Republic was growing weaker, and support was waning. Among some, however, they were trying to leave, seeing the writing on the wall. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and the US withdrew from Vietnam, but the Communist North, being who they were, decided to break it immediately. A plan was made to improve logistics through Cambodia to Loc Ninh, which was at the time the provisional capital of the Viet Cong. In March, President Nixon implied he would get involved in Vietnam if the North invaded, but they didn't take it seriously. As that began, so did the 1973 oil crisis, which caused rapid inflation in South Vietnam. The government had issues paying soldiers and restricted ammo and fuel use. One American businessman living in Saigon stated making money in South Vietnam was almost impossible. After clashes in 1974 left 55 South Vietnamese dead, the president stated that the war was back on, and the agreement was void and null because the North had broken it. But the war never really stopped because during that ceasefire period, 25,000 South Vietnamese had died. The North launched a conventional invasion but stopped after a few days and withdrew back across the DMZ. No, not that DMZ. This was just to test the South. Finally, the North launched its final invasion of the South, a conventional invasion without any guerrilla tactics. The fight was on. North Vietnamese forces swept through the country, and the South Vietnamese president ordered his rival back into the military but resisted calls to make him prime minister. Morale was low in South Vietnam. As the PAVN advanced, a last-ditch effort was made by the ARVN 18th Division at the Battle of Xuan Loc from the 9th to the 21st of April. Thieu resigned on the 21st of April and fled to Taiwan. He nominated his vice president, Tran Van Hoang, as his successor. After only 1 week in office, the South Vietnamese National Assembly voted to hand over the presidency to General Dong Van Minh again. Minh was seen as a more conciliatory figure toward the North, and it was hoped that he might be able to negotiate a more favorable settlement to end the war. And I mean, they weren't wrong, considering he got off pretty easily after the war ended. The US began a mass evacuation of American citizens from the country, and in April, creating images such as helicopters being thrown off the deck to make room for more. Finally, on April 30th, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, forces from the North made their way into the city, and the last civilians, which were Vietnamese, boarded a helicopter and left the city. This brought an end to the Vietnam War, and Saigon was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City, after the late rebel leader who, despite being a communist, was actually willing to negotiate with the Americans and was a lot more open. But he had died a year before the war ended, and his dream of a Vietnam never materialized. And, despite that long explanation, that is a very simplified history of South Vietnam. But we're not done yet. On to what this video is actually about. After the war, overseas Vietnamese that escaped began to revere the Republic of Vietnam, and the old flag of South Vietnam was and is flown everywhere. If you go to a little Saigon, it'll be the old flag flown, and over the years, movements to bring back the Republic or install a new democracy in the entire country were and are still being made. In Los Angeles, there's a huge Vietnamese community flying the flag and still talking about freedom. Located in the city of Westminster, the Little Saigon area has a museum, several shops, and organizations, including the Third Republic of Vietnam Government in Exile. A government in exile that's actually been responsible for some peaceful demonstrations in Vietnam, and has so far been the most effective opposition force in the country. Many around the world use the flag of South Vietnam to resist communism. Recently, it was officially recognized by the US government as the Vietnamese freedom flag. Many former residents of South Vietnam still do have resentment towards the West for betraying the country when they were most needed, saying that with more support they could have won. Calling South Vietnam a nation betrayed. This sounds a lot like the fall of Kabul, because it basically is the fall of Kabul. Many overseas Vietnamese see the Vietnam War as a struggle to resist communism. They believe the Republic of Vietnam was fighting against the communists to protect its people from a totalitarian regime, which they associate with repression, loss of freedom, and political persecution. Many also recognize the internal problems within South Vietnam that contributed to its fall. Some overseas Vietnamese acknowledge that the South Vietnamese government, especially under Ngo Dinh Diem, lost legitimacy among parts of the population due to its repressive tactics and inefficiencies. So, even if the nation itself fell long ago, its memory lives on in pro-democracy movements. Most overseas Vietnamese still use the South Vietnam flag, and the culture, pride, and spirit of South Vietnam lives on. But in the former lands of South Vietnam, things are a bit different. 50 years after the fall of Saigon in 1975, sentiments in the former South Vietnam, particularly among older generations and their descendants, remain complex, emotional, and deeply personal. The way people feel about the former Republic of Vietnam is shaped by experience, generational memory, and the evolving political and social landscape of modern Vietnam. Many older people who lived through the days of South Vietnam, especially those who worked in the government, military, education, or business, continue to still feel pride and nostalgia for what they saw as a more open, cosmopolitan, and hopeful time. Despite the war, young people in South Vietnam, especially those in urban centers, have grown up in a Vietnam that is changing fast. Globalized, more open economically, and digitally connected. Often, histories gloss over or vilify the Republic in modern Vietnam, which creates intrigue. YouTube, overseas Vietnamese content, and social media have opened a window into old music, photos, and stories from the Republic era. This generation doesn't necessarily want the Republic to return, but they increasingly see it as a part of a shared identity and not the enemy. Even without explicit political loyalty, many people in the South retain a distinct cultural identity that echoes the South Vietnamese dialect and expressions, often discouraged after 1975, but remain widely spoken as a sign of pride. Pre-1975, music, especially Nhạc Vang, is cherished, even if once banned. There's a strong sense of regionalism in the South. Many in the South continue to culturally and politically feel distinct from the North. With the rise of the internet, young Southern Vietnamese are now learning the truth about the Vietnam War, and its rapidly changing society in South Vietnam, especially in Ho Chi Minh City. In the former South Vietnam, the Republic is remembered with a mix of pride, pain, and silence. It's not just a political memory, but an emotional inherence, passed down in hidden songs, photographs, and unspoken grief. As we can see, 50 years after the war, things are changing, but that's sort of how history always works. It's always being rewritten. These days, the South Vietnamese perspective is being increasingly talked about, and the Vietnam War is being seen as more than just an America versus Vietnam thing, but as a three-pronged war. The legacy of South Vietnam has a mixed reaction in the current-day Vietnam. Some view it as an oppressive government that needed to be liberated, but others view it as a better and more open time. It's very complex, but today, most have moved on, and I don't think that there is going to be a new republic in Vietnam for a long time. But we should be viewing the war as a three-pronged one, because, unfortunately, there are several South Vietnamese veterans who gave their lives for a country that no longer exists, but because there's no country to tell their story anymore, they're increasingly not giving it any attention, and should be. The men of the South Vietnamese army were some of the bravest in the world, and their sacrifice has gone unnoticed. So, that's one of the things I wanted to point out with this video, is to not only respect your American Vietnam vets, but also your Vietnamese Vietnam vets. 50 years on, we shall see how South Vietnam is remembered, but we will also see what the future holds for the current-day Vietnam.